Okay, this is probably it is my first political video on YouTube, but we'll see how it goes. But what you've got in Europe at the moment is a flood of what they're calling migrants. Migrants one day, asylum seekers next, or even in the same conversation. Now, when I've looked at the figures, I would say the Syrians are only about 40% of the amount of people coming into Europe. Why is it relevant? It's how the media is wording it, which is very, very specific, because it's selective, because there's a lot of people coming in from Bangladesh and other places as well, which obviously aren't in a war zone, but we'll push that to one side. Now, that's my first issue, is the fact is that it's not clearly defined what is a migrant, because what you really want to say is true asylum seekers. True being they are actually asylum seekers, because the rest have no reason to be in Europe. Now, the next thing is the bit that should concern a lot of Europeans is the UK's biggest gripe, beyond giving away billions to the EU, is the freedom of movement. Now, when the Polish arrived in the UK, it wasn't to do with freedom of movement, etc., although this is how they got to the UK. The reality is the UK were looking to bring down the value of its construction labour. As such, the powers that be utilised the freedom of movement to allow Polish workers to come in at the UK and bring the prices down, especially in central London, which has got stupidly overpriced land. But hey ho, that is freedom of movement. Now, in reality, it will take wealth away from the UK. At the same time, do I have an issue with this? I would say, if it's stabilised throughout Europe, probably not. The reason being is, if we're a European Union, then we're one nation. Whether we're small countries or whatever, we're supposed to be under one banner. As such, the share of wealth is fair enough. For those that are pro-British and say they're taking all our jobs, blah blah blah, please remember London sucked dry the UK. 3/4 of all the jobs in the UK are in London. There's nothing in Wales, there's nothing in Scotland. Everything has been pulled towards London, even in England. If you go to West Midlands, look at Birmingham. Didn't even get a shot at the the Olympics. Let's be honest, it was never going to get the Olympics, because everything goes to London. So what do you owe London? They may want to fly the banner the British is best, but the reality is they haven't helped you, have they? The whole country has not benefited. But that's another subject. So my point being is, the UK wants rid of freedom of movement now, because if it stems that one, I think most politicians can get away with everything else. Because let's be honest, politicians are self-serving. Politicians create the EU so they can skip between the UK when their time's up as an MP and become a MP in the EU, or some government made up job of some description that is already triplicate. I'd say triplicate because we have local government, we have national governments, and then we have the EU government. So the minimum is a lot of these jobs have got 3 people doing them at different levels. So that ain't going to change. Let's be serious here. They've just expanded the House of Lords. But the point here is the risk to the freedom of movement of Europe, which will come around, I think, because of the Syrian crisis. Why? Because everybody that's coming off these boats on the coast and are being ferried throughout Europe are going to Germany or the UK. That is not in line with EU regulations. It's not in line with pretty much anything, because they're supposed to go to the first safe country. Now bear in mind, most of these would have been in the safe countries. They're already in Turkey, etc. They'd already left the war zones, so they were already in a safe haven of some description. Not great. That's the important bit here. Not great. There is no new life there. It's basically sitting on the border in a tent, waiting until the war stops and go home and rebuild from scratch. But this is why it's concerning, because when the people are flooded into Europe, now they've seen there's access to Europe because somebody's left the door open. They're all going to the UK and they're all going to Germany, where there's better financial assistance, there's better housing access, there's more job opportunities, etc., etc. Now, why do I have a problem with that? Because the burden of the EU is shared. As you just heard about what I said about London, the fact is that wealth should be shared. You know, at the end of the day, job generation should exist. If you start pushing people into two major areas of Europe, you got a big problem. Financially, it puts the burden on two countries. But on top of that, somebody is going to say, stop the EU freedom of movement. Now, the EU freedom of movement allows myself to move to Spain, to Germany, pretty much anywhere in Europe as a EU citizen. If they close those borders and make it localized, so that you can't travel between different countries, then it's going to affect EU citizens, and not in a good way, not in a nice way, but would also be one way that the UK would stay in Europe, because with all the political rumblings, this would give them, the government, the access to going, look, we did what we promised. We've restricted stuff. We haven't left Europe because they do not want a referendum. I told you this already. The fact is, politicians do not want the end of the EU. EU is the gravy train. EU creates jobs for them. But if they turn around and says, we've closed the borders, which is the biggest argument, which will go on for how many years now, this anti-immigration stuff in the media, they would turn around and say, look, we did something. And I'll do another video on this from my perspective. But the fact is, be very, very careful, because I can see them getting rid of the EU freedom of movement, which will then localize all the rules for everybody. At the same time, for the average person, without that rule, there is nothing in Europe for most people. Thanks for watching.